Next up on the Ranking the President series is going to be Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. Jefferson, again, we're looking at four criteria. I'm actually going to make it five criteria. The four criteria are growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and I'm adding something that I've already been discussing with the other two, but I'm making it formally a fifth criteria, and that is, did you leave the country better or worse than you found it? Because I think that really is the fundamental question to ask of every president. That's the most important question. Because if you come in with an absolute mess and you leave less of a mess, I think that's a more successful presidency than someone who comes in with a great option, with everything going well, and leaves it not going quite as well. So starting with growth, Jefferson knocks it out of the park. Louisiana Purchase. You cannot argue that the Louisiana Purchase was not a wonderful thing for America, for the country, in every way, shape, or form. Sure, the Native Americans actually owned the land, but having the Europeans just acknowledge that that huge amount of land is now considered to be American for the price of, I think, $500,000 in today's terms. I think it was $15 million at the time, $500,000 then. Yes, you had to borrow money to do it, which again, this goes back to I wouldn't even call it a problem with Jefferson. It's something that you have to deal with when you're talking about Jefferson. Jefferson is a hypocrite. Jefferson says one thing and does another. In so many instances, it's almost funny. And in this instance, he came in like, we shouldn't borrow, we shouldn't take any debt, and then he borrows to purchase Louisiana. It was the right thing to do, and that's what I also kind of circle back to with a lot of Jefferson is he was a hypocrite, but a lot of the times his hypocrisy, not always, we're not going to get the sell him this thing. A lot of times his hypocrisy was also him going, oh, yeah, the thing I was talking about with a flowery language and writing in these flourishes and having my idealized world, I'm more of a realist. And when the opportunity comes, I'm not going to say to the French, no, I'm not going to take half of the country, doubling the size of the United States, expanding it basically out. Arguably, if you want to have the whole fight over what the Oregon Territory was, arguably all the way to the West Coast, I'm not going to concede that because on principle, I don't think we should borrow money. So Jefferson, for growth alone, that's one of the greatest presidents in terms of growth, possibly the greatest. I think there'll be a debate later when we get to maybe Polk. But otherwise, I don't think anyone really can argue that Jefferson's expansion of the country is amazing, and full props to him. Finances. Jefferson balanced the budget, despite borrowing money for the Louisiana Purchase, despite spending on things like the Lewis Clark expedition and setting the foundations for the national road that would come later. Although I guess the national road funding would come to later presidencies, so maybe that's something we should hold against him. I think that there's some stuff he left unfinished and some things he left broken for the past presidents that I think often gets overlooked that should be on his tab. We'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of finances, he did balance the budget. You can quibble with where he cut, and I think I will do that when I get to the war and security section. But unlike most American presidents, he did not run a significant deficit. He did also, generally speaking, with some small exceptions, invest in things appropriately. Again, he did do the Lewis and Clark expedition. He did buy Louisiana Purchase. He did set the foundations of the national road. Again, you want to give credit to Congress, you can give credit to Congress if you like. The president is still the president during that term, and the president should always have influence over Congress, and he did. And I believe that Congress was also his party. So in those terms, again, I'm not going to say he was perfect financially. There are some things he should have invested in and spent money in, but he did balance the budget. He did not run up a deficit for the person who came after them. You got to give him credit on that. In terms of international politics, this is a little bit fuzzier. The Barbary War and the war with the Barbary pirates is interesting and a difficult conversation to have because he did build some ships to go. Basically, there had been deals with the British Navy to protect American ships until the war, and then after the war, merchant ships going through the Barbary Coast, which is going to be anybody going into the Mediterranean, more or less. You got to go through Gibraltar. So up to this point, we had been paying bribes. Jefferson constructed some frigates, blockaded, I think, Algiers. He engaged in things to deal with it, but in the end, he also did pay some bribes. So I kind of feel like that's a neutral. I also think more to the negative, and I think this is something that I would actually say he does not get enough negatives for, because I do think it's the foundation for the War of 1812 and the Embargo Acts. In 1807, I believe it was, he started putting embargoes on France and Britain because they were trying to make the Americans not be neutral in their war. So the French and British were at war, the Napoleonic Wars and all that kind of stuff. And Jefferson's antagonism was unsuccessful, and it really set the foundation for the War of 1812, which is where I'll go ahead and drift into war and security. This is the one area where I think you have to knock Jefferson. Jefferson, yeah, he did send the ships to deal with the Barbary pirates, um, but he did not invest nearly enough in the Army and Navy. He argued that it didn't make any sense to invest in these things in peacetime, and I think that came back to bite us all, to bite Madison particularly in during the War of 1812, and was a large part of why they were able to burn Washington to the ground. In defense of Jefferson, and a light defense because it's his own making, there was a presumption by a lot of the founding fathers, not by Washington, which I discuss in a video. Well, I will discuss in a video that'll be coming out at some point on Washington the Second Amendment. There was an assumption by a lot of the founding fathers that the militia would be sufficient, that if the people were united, they would be strong enough to overthrow a powerful, trained military, and that just ain't the so. You can't just have farmers pick up rifles and act like a military. That's not how anything works. I think that was exposed during the War of 1812, and even though the War of 1812 wasn't on Jefferson's watch, I think him defunding the army, not sufficiently investing in the Navy, was a large part of why, and also being antagonistic with the Embargo Act, was a large part of why 3 years after his presidency ended, he left office in 1809. 3 years later, Madison found himself in a whole world of hurt during the War of 1812. So I think that is something you have to put on his ledger. All that being said, the final category: was the country better or worse after Jefferson left? I think uncategorically. You can't argue that the America wasn't better off after Jefferson left than before. The Louisiana Purchase alone would certainly make that argument. You doubled the size of the country. You set the foundations for the Lewis and Clark expedition to even explore that country. You started investing in the national road. You banned the international slave trade. So that occurred during his time. Now, obviously, people were still going around it, but the banning of the international slave trade, huge thing for America, and setting the foundations of us stopping to be this state that was basically dependent on international trade, dependent on people sending slaves. Jefferson was, I think everyone was at this point, more than open to having people come to America. I think one of the reasons that America was successful was because during the wars of Europe, there were a lot of refugees who came to America, and we had lots of land. And it was a great situation for people coming from other places who had skills or were just farmers. And not the farmers don't, take that back. Farmers have skills. People who had skills, including farming, who could come here and take advantage of the land that was widely open because of the unfortunate events that were happening to Native Americans since we got here. Specifically, the fact that every time the Native Americans were exposed to people from Europe, some like 80% and 90% of them caught diseases they'd never been exposed to before and died in great numbers. So there was a lot of open land because of the death of many, many Native Americans, plus all of the other horrible genocidal things we did. I want to make sure we acknowledge that every time we go through this. But Jefferson wasn't like we will get to later. We are going to get to some dark places in American history with regards to the Native Americans in the not too distant presidencies we have coming up. And I think Jefferson was not among the worst of those. And I definitely think Jefferson left the country better than he got it. So where does it leave us in the rankings? So the point of this video is, once we discuss the president, we're going to compare them to all the presidents that came before. So we're going in order, and we're going to compare them. So only two presidents have come before Jefferson, Washington and Adams. I think Washington is better than Jefferson. I think Washington left the country much, much better than he found it, and inherited a situation that was far worse than Jefferson inherited. Jefferson inherited a fairly stable country. Washington inherited an absolute mess after the collapse of the Articles of Confederation, and you're just coming out of a war, just completely horrible situation, and he made a country out of that. So I'm going to put him not ahead of Washington. Washington's still going to be number one. But I am going to put him ahead of Adams. I don't think Adams moved the country forward. I think the Alien and Sedition Acts, which Jefferson largely rescinded, although they still stay on the books, but he didn't operate them. I think Jefferson was definitely better than Adams. Adams made a lot of mistakes. If you were asking me which was the better founding father, I would have a difficult time with that. I probably would take Adams over Jefferson. In terms of president, I don't think it's a contest. I think Jefferson's a better president. So the rankings are going to be Washington number one, Jefferson number two, Adams number three.